Well, hello everyone, and many thanks for joining Carbon Brief's webinar on China's new climate pledge, which was delivered last week at the UN Climate Summit by China's President Xi Jinping. I'm Dr. Simon Evans, Carbon Brief's deputy editor, and I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of experts today to help us dig into what is surely one of the biggest climate news stories of the year. So today we have with us Shuo, Director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute. We have Lauri Miliverta, Lead Analyst and Co-founder at the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air. We have Rainer Shuo, Associate Research Professor at the University of Maryland Centre for Global Sustainability, and Carbon Brief's own Annika Patel, our China analyst. So we're at this. We've just had this UN climate summit last week, which was seen as like a really big signpost on the road to COP30 in Brazil in November. And of course, this year is seen as a particularly important one for the Paris Agreement. It's of course 10 years since the Paris Agreement was created in Paris, 10 years, 2015. And it's also a moment when, under the Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism, countries are supposed to be coming forward with new pledges out to 2035. And then, of course, at the same time, we're in this increasingly fractured and difficult geopolitical environment, which is casting a shadow across all sorts of multilateral cooperation. So to take us a little bit deeper into the China situation, Annika, could you just give us a sense of what's been going on over the past year in China?
Sure, thank you, Simon, and welcome everyone. Well, that's a question that could take up this whole webinar, I'm sure, but I'll try to be brief. For me, the kind of standout developments fall into three buckets. So the first is significant additions of energy, both in terms of low carbon sources and also fossil fuels. As I'm sure a lot of you who read our newsletters and our articles will know, China's added significant amounts of low carbon power, notably wind and solar. So that's almost 1,700 gigawatts of wind and solar, feeding into about 2,200 gigawatts of low carbon power as of August. Sorry, yeah, low carbon power as of August this year, as well as 1,500 gigawatts of current fossil fuel power capacity, mostly coal with a little bit of gas. And that's to feed the massive ramp ups of energy demand that we've seen, particularly this year. So, if I'm right, this year alone, we've seen record high energy demand at least three times. And that's something that the government has quite kind of interestingly and notably been putting out warnings about to explain its own kind of how it's rationalizing and how it's viewing all of these energy additions is just to meet this spiking energy demand. At the same time, kind of again, kind of fueled by this kind of massive energy demand and not concerns, but and people trying to figure out the right pathway to address that. We've also got significant moments of transition that we've seen developments this year. So one of those transitions is the transition from what China calls the dual control of energy to the dual control of carbon. And what that essentially means is now China is kind of shifting to look a lot more at the carbon intensity and also the carbon emissions that its economic activity is producing. And the deadline for that is to have to kind of be factoring in an absolute emissions cap into everything by 2030. So you're starting to see a lot more structures come into place, especially this year with kind of expansion of the carbon market, etc., to kind of meet that goal. At the same time, we're kind of seeing a transition from these massive additions of energy, sorry, of power, so adding power capacity to the grid, to really trying to figure out how to integrate that. So Lowry and his team at Korea and other analysts have been putting out really interesting numbers about, for example, utilization rates of wind and solar, We're seeing targets now for energy storage in the next couple of years. We're seeing a lot more emphasis on reforming power pricing and unifying kind of power grids to try and figure out a system where wind and all of this kind of added wind and solar can become a reliable and kind of constant and manageable source, kind of backbone for China's power grid in the years ahead. And then for me, the third thing is just kind of a re-emphasis of what climate change and what extreme weather is doing to China and how it's affecting China's economic growth, especially. So one part of that is the extreme heat that sorry, the kind of extreme power demand spikes that we've seen, and that's driven in no small part by extreme heat in the summer and kind of knock-on cooling demand. And so that's driving concerns around energy security, right? And how to kind of power that with just clean energy sources. But at the same time, we've seen deadly floods, um, and we've seen constant or kind of constant reports of extreme rainfall. And so that's also underscoring the risks that climate change poses to the country and to its development long term. So all of this is kind of feeding into the kind of constant calculus around China's climate policy, and especially has been feeding into these NDCs.
Great. Thanks for that overview, Annika. Let's jump straight to it now and get on to what China's pledge actually is. Rainer, could I maybe turn to you? And I think you said you had a nice table summarizing all of the pledges that President Xi made last week. What's actually in the targets?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And also, hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join today's webinar. Thank you, Carbon Brief, for organizing and for inviting me to the panel. So before I dive into the China-specific targets and to your question, I'd like to take a step back and also comment briefly about what ambitious and good target mean for different country. I think the NDC process under Paris is really nationally driven, so it's largely diverse, which creates analytical challenges for consistent understanding and evaluation of climate ambition across different countries. So at the Center for Global Sustainability at University of Maryland, we take a bottom-up approach to develop the country-specific high ambition pathways that balance between a high level of climate ambition aligned with Global 1.5, but also taken into account national circumstances with a clear and plausible policy strategy for implementation to kind of assess what's the best possible outcome for each country. And we do it carefully, consistently. I think it really provides complementary information to a lot of the global top-down analysis about 1.5 aligned pathway that based on cost effectiveness or like some equity principle to allocate the emission reduction across countries. So last week, we launched a new website of country climate ambition, which provides the latest summary of our assessment of the plausible high ambition pathways for initial round of 12 countries. That includes China. We'll get into about our assessment of China, but also include Australia, Brazil, Canada, EU, India, Indonesia, Japan, Mexico, South Korea, South Africa, and the United States. Also happy to put a link later in the chat. So we hope this can provide a benchmark for comparing with the already announced or to be announced 2035 NDCs for different country. And collectively, this globally can deliver a 39 to 43% of global greenhouse gas reduction by 2035 from 2023 level. So with all of that in the background, I do want to share our assessment of China's plausible high ambition pathway. That's deliver 27 to 31% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 from the 2023 level, which is likely close to the peak emission. In addition, we also model a current policy pathway for China, which largely following the ongoing trend happening in the country, and that also achieves a 10 to 14% reduction by 2035 from the 2025 peak emissions level. So both kind of a scenario suggests a larger reduction compared to the 7 to 10% overall emission reduction target in GHG. So let me kind of now pull up the table that Simon mentioned that provides more detail, unpack each of the components under the two scenario model that we can also compare to the sub targets in China's new NDC. So we actually model a lot of different policies under the two scenario, but we find out electricity generation will be largely driving the overall emission for China and also provide the largest potential for emission reduction. So you can see under our current policy scenario for 2035, wind and solar total install capacity is over 4,000 gigawatt, and it's over 4,700 gigawatt under high ambition. That kind of translate to an average annual build out of over 240 gigawatt per year under current policy and over 300 gigawatt per year under high ambition. And in comparison, like what's the current deployment rate look like in 2024? It was kind of the record is 358 gigawatt, which is likely to be broken again this year, given it's what's already being installed. And the announced 3,600 gigawatt target that translates to approximately 200 gigawatt per year of the annual build out. But of course, if you look at the solar and wind electricity generation percentage, that's almost 50% and 60% by 2035 for China. That's a completely different electricity system compared to today, where you have 55% is still coal generation, which also will be replaced by wind and solar with a fast deployment rate. And related, the total primary energy non-fossil share, that's another sub-target. In the two scenario, it's 40% and 48% respectively, compared to the 30% targets announced. And compared to today, it's almost 20% by 2024. That's kind of give you some of the analysis we produced, but of course, there are also qualitative target included in the announcement that has carbon emissions trading scheme, also the adaptive society language. I think overall, you can see China is taking a conservative approach in terms of the 2035 target, which is kind of somewhat expected given their style of climate commitment in the past. Also, given the greater challenge we have globally and missing global climate leadership internationally. But I think, of course, we were hoping China can take a different approach this year, this time, reflecting what can be fully achieved with the potential. Sorry for the long answer, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a brilliant overview. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure we're definitely going to come on to the question of why this level of ambition. But Li Shuo, I wonder if I could turn to you now and ask. I'm really interested to hear about how we can interpret, or if we can interpret the way that China's target was announced. Obviously, President Xi delivered the pledge personally, albeit not in person. And but then on the other hand, we'd seen some hints in the weeks and months building up to this moment of possible EU-China conversations going on behind the scenes. But of course, previously, running up to the Paris Agreement, for example, we had the joint China-US pledge coming out, so there was a lot more choreography. How would you interpret the way that this happened and the way that it came about?
Sure, Simon, thanks for having me. Look, I took it as a positive sign that President Xi decided to personally announce China's NDC This is also very much in line with previous practice that the Chinese highest level representative will decide and announce China's NDC. So that's actually an encouraging sign. That tells me that there is continued political interest on this issue. Having that said, indeed, going back to Annika's point at the very beginning of this webinar, China is making a decision on its NDC in a highly complex geopolitical environment, and also it has to deal with a lot of complex factors domestically. On the domestic level, the economic slowdown in recent years, and the continued reliance on heavy industries in different Chinese provinces, I'm sure have been a factor in China's NDC decision making. And at the international level, the absence and the retreat of the U.S., the fact that the European Union going into the UNGA not being able to decide on its own NDC, I think those international factors certainly did not go unnoticed on the Chinese side. So really, what we saw, last week announced by President is really a complex set of decision making, having to factor in all those push and pull factors. I think it is also important to realize that with the traditionally cautious and conservative political and diplomatic style of the Chinese system, right, in deciding on targets both domestically and internationally. And what is happening really in the real economy, at least the clean tech part of the Chinese economy, there is increasingly a large gap, a discrepancy between what China is willing to put on the table on paper and what is it actually doing in its real clean tech transition. So I think one way that I would suggest colleagues to look and interpret Chinese NDC is that what we're seeing are mostly floor targets. As Rina has just presented, if you look at the renewable energy target, if you look at the overall emission reduction target, many of those targets we expect them to be over delivered over the next 10 years or so. My last point, maybe at this point in time, is you mentioned EU-China climate engagement. I think this will be a very, very important bilateral relationship in the absence of the US. We have seen during the first Trump administration how the European Union and China work together, along with many other emitters and partners, to hold the fort for climate multilateralism. The point that I want to drive here is politically, the EU-China bilateral relationship is also experiencing a lot of changes. So we cannot easily assume what happened 7-8 years ago will happen over the coming years. I am actually seeing more headwinds and more tensions in this relationship, which I think requires both sides, Brussels and Beijing, to manage this relationship even more carefully so that it actually can deliver the necessary steps and progress needed for a global climate effort.
Thank you. Larry, I'd like to turn to you. You've been writing regular analysis for Carbon Brief on China's energy and emissions trends. Recently you've been pointing to the possibility that an emissions peak could be in sight or potentially could even have been passed. Could you just talk us through a little bit about that? Where do things stand right now? And how much further might China be able to cut its emissions, compared to what it's pledged, if that is indeed a flaw, as Li Shuo's just suggested?
For sure. Thank you, Simon. So China has, over the past 2 years or so, finally gotten to the point where it's been increasing clean energy faster than the total growth of energy consumption and electricity consumption has been. And also clean energy growth has been coming in faster than the average growth in energy demand. So we're really talking about a potential structural peak in total fossil energy consumption, and that has required incredible, mind-boggling amounts of wind and solar. If you know how much a gigawatt is, and you're putting 300, 400 gigawatts per year of wind and solar online, that has been incredible, and it has been also an important driver of China's economic growth, as our research has been suggesting. And so what we've projected is if you take the current rate of clean energy additions that was already achieved in 2023, 25, and the other positive trends that have been going on, like the adjustment of the real estate and construction sector, which is resulting in falling demand for cement and steel, which are the two largest emitting sectors after power and so on. If you take those positive trends, then you're already on track to a 30% reduction in emissions from current levels to 2035, which is in line with the very high end of where you want to be to align with 1.5 degrees. So that's really the opportunity. I think in terms of decision making, one key thing here is that there's at this rate of clean energy growth, there is no more space for both coal power and clean energy. Or coal in general to grow. So if you were to announce targets that would say 20%, 30% reduction in CO2, then you have to recognize that there's going to be a major downsizing of the coal industry, and that seems to be the decision that China's leadership is still postponing. Are you going to put reins on this clean energy boom, or are you going to accept that the coal industry has to start downsizing in a big way? And as we know, as Annika described, there's still been massive investment in new coal-fired power plants, massive investment in new coal mines taking place, even coal-based steel production and so on. So there it's a real clash, and these targets really, to me, showed that the leadership was not prepared to resolve that conflict and say that coal is the one that has to give. The other background that I want to highlight to this decision is that Xi Jinping took very strong decisions that were unilateral or within a very small circle in 2020, 2021, with carbon neutrality and announcing the target to start reducing coal consumption starting from next year. The pledges to strictly control new coal-fired power plants, strictly control high energy, high emission projects, and so on. And to me, it looks like he was not prepared to take this kind of a unilateral step again. So the numbers that were announced last week were very much what we were hearing that the bureaucracy and the more conservative side of China's bureaucracy was proposing for the past year. And so that means that implementing the targets that China has already pledged for 2030, the commitments, the commitment to phase down coal consumption in the next 5 years, and the commitment to reduce carbon intensity are, in fact, even more. They have more teeth than the targets announced for 2035. So it's very important to keep those in picture. And when we actually see the full document of China's NDC, it's very important to pay attention to whether those targets are reaffirmed, whether some of them are made even more specific in an ideal case.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, you already touched on one of the questions I wanted to ask about what was kind of missing from the announcement. We obviously await the full the publication of the full NDC, and I'm sure there will be lots more detailed analysis to be done and tea leaves to be read once that comes out. Um, Rainer, can I come back to you? I'm interested in this, so obviously the target, the headline target that the presidency announced last week is relative to a base to peak emissions, right? It's not relative to 2023 or 2024 or any specific year, and that obviously introduces a bunch of uncertainty. We don't really know what 7 to 10% below peak emissions looks like, and there's quite a wide variation in what that could end up being depending on where the peak and finishes. Can you just talk through why you think that might be? I mean, do you think potentially it's a sign that policymakers were unsure about this idea that China might have peaked? Do they just want to give themselves a bit more flexibility? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you are absolutely right. The announcement is against a peak year, which we are not sure yet when and at what level it will happen. I think that's to some extent it's an interesting and important point China is going through. They are definitely entering the staging period, but it's hard to exactly say it's already happened in a particular year or it will be a phase that have some small fluctuation. But I do think overall the trend of the peaking stage trend that's not going to change, given the economic restructure with the declining demand on energy intensive industrial product, and also the really fascinating renewable and clean technology deployment. All of that trend won't, change or turning away. So I do think it will introduce some uncertainty, but it won't like change the emission outcome dramatically. I think for sure Laura's team also done a lot of amazing analysis on this. I think we're very consistent on that understanding. But also want to comment, I feel like because of it's at an interesting turning point, it's a rapidly evolving situation that the language about striving to do better give us a lot of room for revisit and thinking about if there can be a stronger target once we see how things evolve in the next a few years.
Great, thanks. Larry, looks like you want to come in on this point as well.
Yeah, I did want to highlight two dynamics. So I think this I wanted to highlight this earlier that clearly not in any way recognizing that the peak could have already passed, and at least aren't more emission increases in store. That's really that really speaks to how this NDC just didn't resolve the conflict between the fossil and the clean energy. So basically, the promise of the pledge to peak before 2030 has been that there's another decade of growth for the fossil and especially the coal industry, and not being prepared to say that, sorry, that's off the table now. And the concern, of course, is that the base year, whatever it ends up being, won't be just the base year for the national target, but it will be the base year, highly likely, for the provinces as well. And so that creates an incentive to try and lock in emissions, lock in fossil capacity in the next years, and tracking that and controlling that is incredibly important. And also, because the base year is potentially in the future, it just also means that it's even more important to fulfill the 2030 targets. So if you fulfill the carbon intensity target for 2030, that means that there's no space for emissions to increase from now to 2030. If you fulfill the commitment to reduce coal consumption in the next 5 years, that means that it really eliminates the main source of potential emissions growth. And so that influences not just the emissions over the next decade, but in a way China's entire trajectory, because the targets are based on whatever that base year level ends up being.
Great. Thanks. You sort of slightly hinted at this already, but Annika, I wonder if I can come back to you. There's obviously, not only are we waiting for the full NDC to be published, but there's a whole load of other really important climate policy that we can expect coming out of China over the next few months. Could you just give us a brief overview of what we should be looking out for?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of big moments. This is a very busy year for China's top policymakers. So obviously, one of the big kind of signals that we'll be watching for Carbon Brief is COP30. What else will be announced at COP30 that could signal China's kind of relative level of climate ambition? Will there be kind of especially quantitative targets placed on things like climate finance or funding of the Tropical Forests Forever? I think I'm missing an F. Tropical Forest Forever Fund that Brazil is hosting. Will there be more announcements around South-South cooperation? Will there be what will kind of China's signaling and its actions around language on fossil fuels and especially coal in the final COP30 outcome be? All of that will kind of add to the kind of signals and the tethers that we've got that will help us understand the direction of China's overall climate policy. Then at the same time, we've got the 15th five-year plan coming up. So for those of you who aren't deep in the weeds in Chinese policy making and policy structures, China has kind of overall development plans and economic plans that run every 5 years. 2025 is the end of the 14th of these five-year plans, and we're expecting a new set of overarching targets for 2026 to 2030, inclusive. And traditionally, there have always been a couple of climate targets. So, for example, energy intensity and carbon intensity in the next plan. Policymakers are meeting in late October to kind of hammer out a lot of the details about this. And from then we can expect to maybe start seeing signals about what will the level of climate ambition for the next 5 years be. And obviously that will then affect the fourth NDC. It will affect annual targets that the Chinese government sets. And yeah, so that will, again, big questions around when will China start setting kind of more ambitious absolute caps, etc. On top of that, as Simon mentioned, there's a lot of kind of very nitty-gritty uh, policy mechanisms that are kind of being formed. So, for example, as Larry mentioned, provincial targets will be quite important. We're seeing the provincial power quotas, known as RPS, become a lot tighter and be expanded to also cover specific heavy industries, for example, steel, aluminium. Will those kind of will the level of ambition in those quotas ramp up? Which, again, kind of for me, I always find it a little bit more interesting to look at what's happening at the provincial level because that's where all of these kind of big headline targets are actually getting implemented and we're actually seeing the pace of change. Similarly, the carbon market is expected to expand to cover cement, aluminium, and steel. Will activity in those markets kind of increase, and will that present an actually more concrete barrier or restriction on the amount of emissions that these heavy industries can put out? It's something to watch, but it's definitely something that the ME is focused on. And then, as Shuo mentioned, kind of this the balance between actual levels of policy ambition and looking at the real economy, like how much is the kind of market dynamics of solar and wind especially, but also EVs and batteries and hydrogen electrolyzers and all of these different low carbon technologies. Are they being constrained by the policy dynamic? Are they expanding both domestically in China and overseas, despite perhaps more conservative targets? And could they, as all of our panelists have mentioned, push for higher ambition in the future? It's an open question. And yeah, something to be watching in the year ahead.
Thanks, Annika. as our listeners can tell, we're going to be very busy at Carbon Reef, probably forever, but particularly in terms of China. Li Shuo, I'd like to come back to you. Obviously, in response to China's pledge last week, there's been quite a lot of sort of fairly negative reaction. We've had the EU's climate commissioner, Wopke Hoekstra, saying it's not ambitious enough, and many other similar comments. But at the end of last week, you wrote a comment piece for the New York Times suggesting that we shouldn't just judge China's climate ambition by the headline emissions target alone. I wonder if you could just talk us through your arguments on this.
Sure, Simon. I think that argument, that if we're only looking at China's NDC, in particular the headline target, at its face value, we're sort of missing the forest for the tray. I think that argument is very much underpinned by the real economic transition that is happening in China, in particular. Now the dominating position of China in almost all the clean tech sectors, solar, wind, EV, electric, batteries and so on. China now produces the lion's share of all these green goods and products. And by doing so, and I want to pivot back to Lowry's earlier studies. These clean tech sectors have contributed so much to China's economic growth in recent years. So really, the political point here is there has been a very strong alignment now in the Chinese system between its decarbonization goals and its economic development agenda. That strong alignment, I would argue, you are not seeing anywhere else in the world, at least not as strongly as in China's case. I think that strong alignment is what will propel the country to cut more carbon over time, in particular over the next decade or so. And that clean tech development is something that I think we should not miss. In addition to, of course, the importance of the NDC. I also think when you begin to realize the other side of the China climate story, the clean tech development, then perhaps a different set of questions and a different set of spaces will emerge, right? That you will then begin to realize it is not necessarily just the EU-China climate relationship, right, between the climate commissioner and his Chinese counterpart. It is not necessarily just the COP that we should pay attention to, right? The new actors that are emerging, we will probably need to pay attention to BYD, the leading Chinese EV maker, CATL, the leading battery producer. We need to pay attention to Brazil, not just the Berlin COP30, but the investment of BYD there, taking over an old Ford factory. Probably need to pay attention to Indonesia, the bilateral commercial relationship, Chinese investment in that country. Those factors and those actors, I think, over the next 10 years or so, will begin to drive carbon emission reduction in a more significant and more meaningful way than countries' NDCs. So that point, I think, should not be missed in the overall scheme of things, in how we can interpret and look at countries' NDCs.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Thanks, Isha. Particularly in the context of, the discussion about whether the COP process itself needs reform, whether we need to somehow find a way to drive that process, from into a period of implementation, having been coming up with the Paris Agreement rules and coming up with pledges and so on. Now we need to actually implement it. And what you're talking about very much speaks to that actually already happening in some places. We've got millions and millions of questions from our readers and from the listeners tuning in today. And I'd love to try and squeeze in a few of those now, if I can. So I'm going to start with a question from Johannes Schuler at the European Commission's DG Klima. And he asks, where do the panelists assume that China will be in 2035 in terms of its relative emissions reductions compared to 2024 levels, just based on where we're headed now, based on the current policies? I don't know if maybe each of you could just answer that really quickly because I'd be sort of fascinated to hear the differences. So Larry, if you want to go first on that.
I think the power sector will be not at a 30% reduction, but we'll see a significant reduction even on current trends, as Shuo described. The current relatively unambitious target setting affects more those sectors where you really need government policy and action, such as non-CO2 greenhouse gases, some of those sectors where electrification doesn't really do the trick, like chemicals and so on. So I think that will dilute the overall emission reduction, but I'm hopeful that we will see at least something in the 10 to 20% range just on the current policy settings from current levels, and quite possibly also once the peak is clearly passed, the leadership stepping forward and increasing the level of ambition, like happened with the previous NDC 5 years after it was filed.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I don't know if you want to come in on that briefly.
Yeah, I may take a more optimistic number here. I think one argument is like we've been repeatedly and kind of consistently underestimate how clean technology development deployment happening in the past 10 years. I have the same hope for like the modern storage and also other clean technology can support China to build the new electricity system. And China is the one that can pioneer a lot of the spaces. So I would really feel like we can thinking about 20% above, even following kind of the current trend. But yeah, just offering my sense here.
Thank you. Li Shuo, I don't know if you want to come in on that. Otherwise, I've got lots more questions.
Sure. Just very briefly, 2035, where we will be. In addition to the emission reduction, I don't see China's dominance when it comes to the clean tech sector going away. So, the 80% of solar panels produced by China, I don't think that number will change that much. So I think we need to be prepared for that. And, for the rest of the world, this really brings, the following question to the fore, which is noting China's clean tech dominance. How the rest of the world decide to work with China or not will be a very, very consequential question that will determine the world's climate future.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on to another slightly different question now, which is from an anonymous attendee. Thank you, whoever you are. So they've asked, allowing for the fact that China has said it's striving to do better than the pledge, it still seems likely, they say, that given the rest of the world's targets, that we're heading for more than 2.5 degrees of warming at present, which I think is hard to disagree with. And they say that this would transform climate risks in China and obviously elsewhere from perhaps manageable challenges to more kind of chronic, systemic, and escalating crises. And so their question is to what extent is China also planning major investment in adaptation? Of course, this is one of the things that we don't know based on the pledge last week because we haven't seen the full NDC. I don't know if any of you want to volunteer to take that one.
I want to jump on the preamble, which is I think we are just starting to appreciate the effect of the drop in especially solar and battery and EV costs. Most governments, most companies, most consumers for sure have not done the math on what their energy plans should look like with the reduction in costs over the past couple of years. And I think that's going to bend the curve much more than we factored in to date. So I wouldn't be as fatalistic about the temperature rise. I will say that China is a country that manages its water resources, land, and so on very, very intensely, and has done that for a long time. So, and obviously doesn't have the kind of absurd shenanigans. We're not allowed to factor in climate change when you're planning for the future on that. And the research on climate impacts and how to prepare for them is very active and high quality in the country. So I think there's quite a bit of appreciation about that, and it's happening as a part of the way that the country has managed its resources very intensely and engineered its resources very intensely for a long time.
Thanks, Larry. Annika.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, so I would say that even though we don't have much detail on what the NDC is going to say about adaptation just yet, we do have a separate adaptation to climate change plan that runs through to 2035. So we can have a sense of what we'll see in the NDC by looking at that. I was speaking to some different NGOs about climate adaptation for a recent piece. And what's quite interesting is that you're seeing a lot of money kind of being funneled into flood relief, into drought relief. And this is, the tens of billions, sometimes the hundreds of billions of yuan, so billions to tens of billions of dollars. And you can kind of see the numbers adding up, and a lot of Chinese government officials in public remarks will, point to this being a significant problem. So there's definitely kind of an awareness of the fact that a lot of money will be needed for adaptation. What's interesting is that you also see references to the fact that right now China's response to adaptation is very fragmented. So so a lot of the time responses to kind of extreme weather is left to provincial level or local level governments. And there are a lot of disconnects in terms of the amount of resources that get to people, disconnects in the way that different governments will handle very similar kind of impacts. And I think that that's an area that the Chinese government has said that it's going to look at a lot more closely, whether it is able to kind of wrangle a uniform response structure on provincial governments is a lot more uncertain. But I think until that happens, it is going to be something where we'll see costs increase significantly until there is this kind of like more uniform response.
Great. Thanks, Annika. I'm gonna try and combine a couple of questions now. So there's a question from Abdullah Bashir Nurai, who works for some sort of forestry company, asking about what the impact of China's infrastructure and energy investments abroad will be, particularly in terms of Africa. And then I'm slightly cheekily going to combine that with a question, another anonymous one, about whether there's concern about in the long term China sort of weaponizing its climate investments in sort of major power competition globally, around energy security and so on. Shuo, you mentioned some of the interactions China's having and the investments it's making overseas. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure, Simon. The broad trend that we are seeing now is, for countries, in particular in the global south, some of the countries have industrial ambition and aspiration as well. And at the same time, they want to decarbonize. Think about South Africa, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, and so on. Just in recent years, we have also seen some of those countries installing trade tariffs on Chinese clean goods and products. So basically saying no to Chinese products. At the same time, to use that no as a way to invite Chinese investment in their country to set up factories and shops so that the manufacturing could actually happen in those countries, contributing not only to the decarbonization of those countries, but also economic growth and development. Which is just, you could argue, a higher, a great way of economic integration, and also a more widespread, actually, a dissemination of low carbon know-how, capital, and technologies. So I just think that is a trend, just kind of looking beyond China's political and commercial relationship with the global north. That's increasingly a trend that is happening on the other side of the world, featuring again more integral and synergistic economic interest. So sort of, China trying to export this strong alignment between the growth agenda and the decarbonization agenda. I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. And I also think, well, many industrialized countries, in particular in Europe, is trying to figure out a balanced response, right, to China's industrial dominance. This China Global South relationship is something that they should also pay attention to.
I want to just throw in one thing because it's directly from a Carbon Brief article that I wrote. But so, in fact, whether you call it weaponization of foreign investments, or whether you call it diplomacy or cooperation or whatever, depending on your perspective, China is in fact way behind on clean energy with that. So if you look at the exports of coal-fired power plants and other fossil technology that China has been pursuing for much longer, they were much more state-driven. There was much more diplomacy, state financing and guarantees and everything going on with those, whereas China's clean energy exports, the vast majority of solar batteries, EVs, are just exported as commodities with no project development or foreign direct investment from China involved. And so in that sense, it's I think it's just natural for Chinese project developers to look for more opportunities to be involved in those projects where Chinese technology is being deployed around the world. And of course, to address the concerns about dependence on imports from China, and to address the aspirations for having more manufacturing locally, which just about every developing country does. It's really important to set up manufacturing in different countries. But even that is if, for example, Indonesia, the commercial drive by a private company is going ahead of where diplomacy is at. And it would have actually been better for everyone if there was a bit more diplomacy involved, for example, in the large solar factory that is coming up in Indonesia, because now it's caught up between unclarity about Indonesia's domestic solar program, Trump tariffs, and so on. So it would be better to have a bit more diplomacy happening around that.
Thanks, Larry. So I'm conscious that we've only got about 5 minutes remaining. I'm just going to ask one final question, and then maybe give each of you maybe like a minute just to reflect on any other final points you'd like to make. So Rainer, if I could just come to you really briefly with this question. It's a bit of a cheeky one from Finn Thomas Widger, saying, given China's current climate ambitions and the pendulum-like nature of US climate policy in recent years, is it actually possible that China will reach carbon neutrality before the United States?
Yes, I think it's a good, I mean, like I know people are wondering about the situation in the United States, and it is a kind of a important period that we see a lot of disruption from the current administration. That at the federal level, we actually do a lot of detailed analysis about what the non-federal leadership could still deliver for the U.S. That will also be included in our U.S. Country assessment on the webpage. We'll have an updated analysis in October. It is being affected, but I think we still see a lot of great potential, great momentum happening at the subnational in the US. It is a short period of time. When we talk about net zero carbon neutrality, that's a long term down the road, and it will be a kind of a affected, but I think it will, we're talking about long term. I don't feel deep worried about the long term goal.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you all 30 seconds if you'd like to make any final interventions, since we're so close to the hour. I don't know who'd like to go first. Rainer, do you want to carry on?
Sure, of course. I see a question about methane actually. I do want to say importantly the inclusion of all GHG is important. We don't have detailed on methane, but I think domestically there are a lot of progress on methane, industrial N2O, F gases that China has been made recently, and it's important to talk about methane globally as well when we thinking about peak temperature limiting overshoot. I just want to kind of emphasize that, and we should all pay attention, especially as China is the largest emitter on methane. Um,
Brilliant, thank you. Larry, do you want to go next?
The only thing from my list that I haven't mentioned is that I just want to say that China is in a tough spot here, and they've in a way it's understandable the points that they've made that a lot of other countries didn't cut emissions any faster after their peaks than they're targeting right now. But the fact is that because of China's size, because of the size of China's emissions, the arithmetic is really unforgiving, and China is in that sense in a really different position than any other country. So on the current trajectory, the minimum targets that China has set for itself, they would use up the entire carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So, there needs to be a bit of understanding that it's tough for China, but there also needs to be this recognition that there is arithmetic at play here, that there's just no way around, and that we have to find solutions to.
Brilliant. Annika, do you want to add anything before we wrap up?
Sure, I guess I would just reiterate that I think as important as it is to look at the top level targets, for me, the most interesting stuff is happening at the local level. So looking at what work NGOs are doing on the ground, looking at, Shandong's recent renewable power pricing auctions and the impacts that that has, looking at these kind of cross-provincial transmission lines and cross-provincial power trading targets, all of these kind of very wonky and very kind of nitty-gritty things is sometimes a lot more interesting, and B, a lot more cause for optimism maybe than central targets.
Brilliant. That's why you work for Carbon Brief, Annika. Lovely. And Shuo, I'll just give you the final word.
Thanks, Simon. Look, I think just while we're looking at the Chinese NDC and we're also expecting a large amount of upcoming NDCs, really the most important question in my mind is what motivates a country, right, when it embarks on climate action. I think the thing that makes China stands out compared to many other countries is, in a way, it has already figured out that question. The motivation is, economic factor. To decarbonize, to cut more emissions will actually be very much in line with China's commercial interest. That, of course, is not to shy away from the fact that China still needs to make a lot of effort when it comes to retiring coal-fired power plants and so on. But the question really to the rest of the world is, what is that motivating factor for your country? Also noting China's dominating position in the clean tech sector, which is really not a political choice. It is now just a structural fact, right? what then can still motivate other countries to embark on climate action, which I think is also a very pointed question asked by some of your participants. And I would just want to kind of endorse that question. That, that is a question that we need to think about and we need to try to figure out in the coming years, in the next few years to come.
Brilliant. Well, just remains for me to thank all of the panelists for really fascinating conversation. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today. Bye-bye.